Hello everyone who study physiology with us. Today we have the new part of the brain. Today we have the practicals about Diencephalon, and we have today a lot of questions and video files. And next slide to this table, here we know forebrain, and the first part of the forebrain, it is a diencephalon. Diencephalon with the diencephalic reflexes. Through this part there is a switching of all the information that comes from the lower areas of the brain into hemispheres and some parts of diencephalon for today. You know this picture. Did you see? I hope you saw the first our previous practical, and here we know forebrain, and this part diencephalon, thalamus and hypothalamus. And one more picture, hypothalamus, neurohypophysis, but it is just endocrine part of the brain, and we will discuss this part in the future when we will study the endocrinology. The forebrain is subdivided into the telencephalon and diencephalon, and for today we will study only diencephalon part, but it's very difficult part of the brain. And let's start from this slide. Here we see the diencephalon and parts of the diencephalon. It is the thalamus, subthalamus, hypothalamus, as a part of the limbic system, and hypothalamus. So what we know about diencephalon? Diencephalon is located between the telencephalon and the midbrain. It consists of structures that are on either side of the third ventricle. A huge number of nuclei are located here, and we will start with the main part of the diencephalon is the thalamus. Here we see the thalamic area. All these structures effectively enclose the third ventricle, but thalamus it occupies 80% of the diencephalon and looks like two X from the one side, the right side of the brain and left side of the brain. The thalamus consists mainly of gray matter, and in this gray matter, as you know, it is bodies of neurons. Here we see a lot of nucleus which contact with different parts of the brain and different parts of the body. And here we see new slides. It's the thalamus, or bedroom chamber, very unsymmetric part of the brain, main part of the diencephalon, have blue colored like an X part of the brain. And here we see a lot of different nucleus of the thalamus. The X-shaped thalamus make up 80% of diencephalon, as I said, and forms the superatrial walls of the third ventricle. Here we see this part, blue colored, and the thalamus is composed of bilateral masses of the gray matter held together by a midline commissure called the intermedialis mass. And here we see new one picture, new one slide that's about the building of the thalamus. Its superior surface is covered by a thin layer of white matter called stratum zonale. Here we see this white matter, and its lateral surface by a similar layer called external medullary lamina. So here we see the parts of the gray matter with a different layer of white matter, And the gray matter of the thalamus is subdivided into three main parts by a sheet of white matter, which we call it intermedial medullary lamina. So we have some white matter inside in thalamic gray matter. So next slide, here we see internal medullary lamina. This lamina is placed vertically. It divides the thalamus into the lateral part, and here we see the L, into lateral part and medial part, and an anterior part situated between the two limbs of it. Anterior part, here we see blue colored, or it just says that anterior nucleus. Within each of these parts, a number of nuclei can be found. Only the most important ones are listed below, but we have so many different nuclei, most named for their location. Each of these nuclei has a functional specialization. Each projects fibers to and receives fibers from the specific region of the cerebral cortex and from the different parts of the body. Do you remember that we have the special part of the brain which just do the transduction of the information from the body, from the different organs of the senses, organs of the body to the brain cortex. And here we see the classification of the thalamic nuclei. It's an oval mass, and two ends, anterior and posterior, and four surfaces, superior, inferior, medial, and lateral, and all these areas have the special name. And here we see the different color, and here we see the not white color laminas, but red colored laminas, which divided all this gray mass on the areas and on the nucleus. So anatomical classification, we have the different nucleus in anterior part of the thalamus, anterior nucleus, lateral, ventral dorsal nucleus, and medial. Here we see the names of this nucleus. As you see, the lateral group and lateral nucleus, the most numerous. And functional classification divides this nuclei into specific and non-specific nucleus. Here we see dorsal thalamus has 15 nucleus. And here we see cell project to the cerebral cortex, ventral thalamus, or reticular nucleus. Do you remember the practice about reticular formation? And we say that reticular formation network contact with the thalamic area of the brain. It's ventral thalamus, and reticular cells, especially the inhibition cells with the inhibition transmitter, GABAergic neurons and synapses project into the dorsal thalamus to inhibit relay cells and function to relate and modulate the flow of information to cortex sensory system, auditory, somatic, visceral, and visual system, contact with the motor system, and regulating states of the sleep and wakeness. So next function classification. We said that we have the specific cells and non-specific cells in the thalamic area. Here we see from res to neocortex, and two types, midline nuclei and centromedial nuclei, and specific from specific sensation to neocortex or limbic system, and types, specific sensory information, motor information, visceral efferent, and integrative function, all this system. So what we have? We have non-specific nuclei. Start from the non-specific nuclei. This nuclei receive impulses from diffuse secondary response from the reticular activating system and project diffusely to neocortex. Here we see specific nuclei receive specific sensation and project to specific portion of neocortex and limbic system and connection of thalamus. Non-specific projection nuclei cause diffuse thalamic projection to enter neocortex, produce electrical activity of cortex, and have efferent and efferent signals from efferents from res. Res, do you remember, it is a part of the reticular formation, and basal ganglia, and efferents from stratum and enter neocortex. Specific nuclei receive specific sensation and project to specific portion of the neocortex and limbic system. And even more, here we see, depending up on the type of sensation, the specific projection nuclei can be divided into 4 groups. And here we see sensory relay nuclei, motor control nuclei, visceral efferent control nuclei, and integrative nuclei, which integrate all function control. And here we see some parts of this. This is specific projection nuclei. And let's look on its first group of sensory nuclei and at the connection with different parts of the brain. Here we see the medial geniculate body is a relay station of the auditory pathways, and medial, ventral, and dorsal nuclei are described within it. Each medial geniculate body receives impulses from the cochlea of both sides, from the right and left sides, and also receives fibers from the auditory area of the cerebral cortex, and these fibers from the part of the descending acoustic pathways. Different neurons in the visceral nuclei, ventral nuclei of the medial geniculate body respond to different frequencies of sound. Tonotopic organization, it is a name, specific name, tonotopic organization. The ventral nucleus projects to the primary auditory cortex. So we have the special part of the cortex of the hemispheres of the brain, and here we see the connection with this part of the thalamic area to the auditory cortex. But we have the one more. We have the lateral genicular body, thalamic area, the lateral genicular body. The lateral genicular body is the relay station of the visual pathways. It receives fibers from the retina of the both eyes, efferent which passes of the internal capsule to reach the visual areas of the cerebral cortex. It is the backside of our skull. The fibers from the different parts of the retina projects to the specific parts of the lateral genicular body. The whole of the retina being represented visotopic organization, like in the previous slide, but with a vision, visotopic organization. In turn, this project to specific areas of the primary visual cortex, and apart from the retina fibers, the lateral genicular body receives fibers from the primary visual cortex and from extrastriate visual areas. It also receives fibers from the superior colliculus and from the reticular formation of the pons and medulla. Noradrenergic fibers. This is a special neurotransmitter, noradrenaline. These fibers, noradrenergic, reach it from the locus coeruleus and serotonergic fibers from the raphe in the midbrain. Here we see the part of the retina and different areas of retina, and genicular body has contact with a different part of the retina, and each area, each field has special connection with a special connection field of the retina. So here we see the whole picture from the retina in our brain. And here we see the next slide. From a clinical point of view, the most important connections of the thalamus are those of the ventral posterior nucleus. We have seen that this nucleus is divisible into ventral, posterior, lateral, lateroventral, posterior medial parts that are sometimes mentioned as separate nuclei. This nucleus receives the termination of the major sensory pathways ascending from the spinal cord and brainstem, and this includes fibers carrying sensation of taste. And within the nucleus, fibers from the different parts of the body terminate in different sequences. And the fibers from the lowest part of the body and in the most lateral part of the nucleus, the medial lemniscus and spinothalamic tracts carrying sensation from the limbs and trunk, and in the ventral posterior lateral part, while the trigeminal fibers from the head, and in the ventral posterior medial part, which also receives the fibers from the chest. And different layers of the cell within the nucleus respond to different modalities of sensation. All these sensations reaching the nucleus are carried primarily to the sensory area of the cerebral cortex. And the next question is the motor nucleus. Here we discussed about sensory relay nuclei, and here we see the motor control nuclei. Motor control nuclei, the ventrolateral nucleus, divisible into interior, posterior, and medial parts of the thalamic area of the brain. And here we see this slide here. Motor nuclei, ventral anterior nucleus, programming of the movements. So we have some nuclei which just programs our body movements. The anterior part of the nucleus projects to the premotor and supplemental motor areas of the cerebral cortex, and here we see the ventral anterior nucleus involved in the programming of movements controlled by the basal ganglia of the brain. Exactly, we will discuss the basal ganglia in the next practical. And we have connection with the cortex. Here we see the efferent and efferent signals and pathways, and even function, planning, programming, and movement. So let's start the planning movement, programming movement, and realize it, this motor action. Ventrolateral nucleus, proprioceptive information, has from our body, from the muscles, and voluntary motor function. Voluntary, it depends from our brain and especially from the cortex. Next part of the nuclei, it is the visceral afferent control nuclei of the thalamic area. Here we see the two parts, anterior and dorsomedial nuclei. And what we have, so we see here we see the visceral nuclei, anterior nucleus from the hippocampus through mammillary body, and we have the concert with recent memory and emotions. concerned with the thinking, memory, judgment, and emotional behavior. And anterior nuclei have this connection with the mammilla thalamic tract and efferent, and function, recent memory, and emotion. So next one, specific projection nuclei in a thalamic area. It is integrative and perceptual function control nuclei, and here we see the part of this nuclei, integrative function control, integration of visual, auditory, and other sensation. Here we see this special neocortex area and green colored area of the thalamic part of the brain, and here we see the connection. We have the optical area of the neocortex and some visual information contacts. So in general we talked about specific nuclei from this part of the slide, and this slide describes non-specific nuclei. They mainly represented the reticular formation, the function of which we discussed in the previous practical. So if you want, we can just remove in this practical. And several slides that describe in more detail the connections of all nuclei and their functions. Here we see the table, and even more, here we see the nuclei, and here we see main inputs, main outputs, diffusive projection in the cortex, and function of each nuclei, which we discussed. Here we see a lot of tables. If you want, we just can to write this table, and here we see the reticular nuclei inside the thalamic area. So thalamus, just let's summarize all function of thalamus. What we know: efferent impulses from all senses and all parts of the body converge of the thalamus and synapses with the least one of these nuclei. Within the thalamus, sorting out the information and in process occur, because you know this reticular formation part has a special neurotransmitter and inhibit some non-very important signals. Just this part of the brain decide what kind of information can be moved in the cortex, and to what kinds of information just stop here and don't move any. So it's sensory relay center, all except olfactory, head ganglion of all sensory system, and thalamic radiations, so just projection fibers from the body to the cortex. And here we see these fibers from the spinal cord through the medulla oblongata and even from the nucleus of cerebellum up. Do you see this connection with the different parts of the red nuclei in the midbrain? And here we see these parts of the thalamic area and different connection with the different parts of the cortex. So it's very important. Inputs having to do this similar function are grouped together and realized via the internal capsula to the appropriate area of the sensory cortex, as well as specific cortical association area and glued center for perception of sensation. We have two qualities of sensation: discriminative nature, it is a type, location by cerebral cortex, specific area of the cortex; affective nature, pleasant, it's unpleasant disagreeable by thalamus, and here we see arousal and alertness reaction, control, level of consequences, maintain state of alertness and wakefulness. And here we see the even more emotional aspects of behavior. It's better, of course, said about humans. Effects as a part of limbic system, circus, and concentrate with recent memory and emotions. And new slide, it's integration of sensory impulses like a general function, a gateway of the cerebral cortex. And here we see a relay station, integration function, processing and modification. It just we can to stop some senses. Integration of the motor function, it is regulation of the muscle tone, and here we see the motor cortex, just connection with the motor centers in the cortex, thalamic area, and of course we regulate the muscle tone with some nucleus in the cerebellum and basal ganglia. About 80% of basal ganglia controls just emotion in our body. Integration of visceral and somatic function. Here we see the thalamic area, and here we see the somatic reaction in our body, autonomic nervous system, vegetative reaction, and hypothalamic area like a part of the just hormonal function, endocrine system. So thalamic, we have the ventral part of the posterior lateral nucleus, lateral henicular body, medial henicular body, anterior nuclear group, ventrolateral nuclei, and ventral anterior nuclei. We discuss all this group of nuclei and function of the thalamic in general on this slide, and we will move on the next part of the diencephalon. It is the epithalamus, new part of the diencephalon. Here was thalamic area, blue colored, and now epithalamus. The epithalamus is posterior or dorsal segment of the diencephalon, and it includes some nuclei and the interconnecting fibers, the commissura and the stria medullaris and the pineal gland special area. And the function of the epithalamus is to connect the limbic system to the other parts of the brain, and the epithalamus also serves as a connecting point for the dorsal diencephalic conduction system, which is responsible for carrying information from the limbic forebrain to limbic midbrain structures. And some function of these components include the secretion of melatonin and secretion of the hormones from the pituitary gland by the pineal gland. Here we see this part of the brain by the pineal gland. Also circadian rhythms regulation and motor pathways and emotional controls and how energy is conserved in the body. So much function. Here we see the pineal gland. It is also called pineal body. Epiphysis cerebelli, epiphysis just and even the third eye, because from some animals it is a part of the brain which just have the third eye. Endocrine, of course, the first function, it is the endocrine secretion of the melatonin. It is a derivative of the serotonin neurotransmitter. It is a hormone that affects the modulation of the wake and sleep patterns and season function, especially for some kind of animals. And it is the name in the middle of the 19th century, the 20th century. Hope is a substance from the pineal may be useful to taking skin disease. In animals, the pineal gland appears to play a major role in the sexual development and hibernation, and metabolism control and season breeding. So here we see the part of the brain, like a pineal body, very little. So extends from the posterior border of the Hypothalamus, and pineal gland secretes the hormone melatonin, which signals the sleep-wake cycle. Do you know these animals which just hibernate? Hibernation is a state of minimal activity and metabolic depression undergone by some animal species, and some species can just sleep all winter. Hibernation is a seasonal heterothermy characterized by low body temperature, slow breathing, and heart rate. Even for this animal, it can be 1 or 2 heart rate in a minute. And low metabolic rate, it most commonly occurs during the winter months, and especially for little animals. The bear is a big animal, but hibernate too. So here we see the temperature control and temperature control occur not only in a human's body, and not only for animal's body, but in human's body too. And look at this. Here you see this as the control of the temperature in a different time of the day. And here we see this rate graph. The morning hours is a maximal activity and replaced by the decrease in the temperature, and in night time just a decrease in the temperature. And because it is a night, that melatonin secretion is the maximum. And you see the circadian clock located in the suprachiasmatic nuclei, and here we see sends information to other hypothalamic nuclei and the pineal gland to modulate body temperature, production of hormones, for example cortisol, melatonin, and secretion of the melatonin peaks at night. Here we see the morning hours and in night time. It's light that inhibits the secretion of these hormones, just light do action on the retina, and there you see these pathways from the retina to the part of the brain, suprachiasmatic nuclei, and the connection with the pineal gland. It is a formula of the melatonin. If you have a problem with the sleeping, in the pharmacy we have the special melatonin drugs, and we can use this for regulation of our sleeping and wakefulness cycle. That everything is under the control of circadian rhythms. Also, there are other rhythms longer. Here we see the chronobiology for first. Field of biology that examples periodic cycles phenomena in living organisms and their adaptation to solar and lunar related rhythms, in general biological rhythms. And here we see the circadian rhythm about 24 hours, so one day. We have the diurnal organisms active during daytime. We have the organisms active in the night time. We have the animals primarily active during the dawn and dark hours, but white-tailed deer, some bats. We have the rhythms cycles longer than one day, annual migration or reproduction cycles, or the human menstrual cycle, and even cycles shorter than 24 hours, like a sleeping cycle, 3-hour cycle for growth hormone production and other hormones production too. And here we see the cycle for different activity in a body, and the pineal gland also influence the production of other hormones and activate different functions of the body. And here we see the next part, it is the hypothalamus. So here we see the hypothalamic area, and hypothalamus is located below the thalamus and keeping the brain stem. And here we see the different parts. Migraine into the midbrain inferiorly, it advances from the optic chiasma to the posterior margin of the mammillary bodies, and the first part, mammillary bodies. These parts are paired nuclei that buggle anteriorly from the hypothalamus that serve as relay station in the olfactory pathways and function of the memory. As you know, the nucleus of the mammillary bodies receives many inputs from the major memory processing structures of the cerebellum and hippocampal formation, and therefore may relate to memory formation. And even more, hypothalamus between the optic chiasma and the mammillary bodies is the infundibulum. A stalk of the hypothalamic tissue connects the pituitary gland to the base of the hypothalamus. And here we see so many nuclei in this area in different color, and like in the thalamus, a different function and with a different color. So in general, the hypothalamus contains about a dozen functional important nuclei. Despite its small size, the hypothalamus is the main visceral control center. Do you remember the practical about the visceral about autonomic nerve system, and we said that the main centers of control of visceral function is the hypothalamus. So of the body, and is vitally important, of course, to overall body homeostasis. Connections, we have the two types always, efferent and efferent connections. With the limbic system, medial forebrain structures, midbrain, tegmentum and retina, thalamus and basal ganglia. Efferent connection with the ventral pathway, stria terminals, medial forebrain bundle, mammillothalamic tract, mammillotegmental tract, hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, and neurons having physiotropic hormones. So we have the different tracts in brain stem, and here we have the scheme, the graphic of this connection with this part of the brain, and the nuclear next part, just to have so many nucleus, and usually we describe the function like shortly in this slide. Function of the hypothalamus: autonomic nerve system regulation, hormone production, and we will discuss this part of hypothalamus in the next semester, in the spring semester. Endocrine regulation, circadian rhythm regulation, limbic system integration, and various like temperature regulation, feeding, etc. Autonomic control center. The hypothalamus regulates involuntary nerves activated by controlling the activity of autonomic centers of the brainstem and spinal cord. In this role, the hypothalamus influences blood pressure, rate and force of heart contraction, motility of the digestive system, respiratory rate and depth and secretion of the sweat and salivary glands. So controls glands but not endocrine glands. A center of emotional response. The hypothalamus has numerous connections with the cortical association areas, lower brain stem centers, and its lines the center of the limbic system which is the emotional part of the brain. Nuclei involved in the perception of fear, pleasure, and rage, as well as those involved in the biological rhythms and of sex, and are found in the hypothalamus too. And center of emotional response. The hypothalamus acts through the autonomic nervous system to initiate most physical expressions of emotion and physical manifestation of the fear. So have the pallor, sweating, dry mouth, and body temperature regulation. The body's thermostat, it is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus receives input from the thermoreceptors located in other parts of the brain as well as in the body periphery, and homeostatic adjustments are then made to the either cool or heat of body, so sweating or shivering. And hypothalamic centers also includes fever. And so here's the body temperature regulation. Here we see the thalamic receptors in the preoptic region monitors the temperature of the body flowing through the hypothalamus, and is this kind of receptors, it is the central receptors. You have the receptors inside, outside on the skin body, we have some receptors inside of our mouth, for example, but inside of our organs and special central organs of the brain, like inside of blood vessels, for example, it's not central, it's periphery receptors of the in temperature of body, but inside of our body. Here we see according to signals received by the preoptic nucleus, hypothalamus initiates mechanism of maintain relatively constant body temperature, cooling, swelling, and heat generation, as you know, and regulation of hunger and thirst. In response to changing levels of glucose, amino acids, and hormones, and even salts in the blood, the hypothalamus regulates feelings of the hunger and satiety ventromedial nucleus. This controls the ventromedial nucleus, just it is the receptors inside of brain. And hunger, you see, the just lack of food, and they regulate the behavior. If some animals want to eat, just hunger, we feel the sense. And regulation of water balance, when the body fluids become too concentrated, hypothalamus neurons called osmoreceptors are activated. These receptors excite hypothalamic nuclei that trigger and release of special hormone, antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary, and this hormone causes the kidneys to retain water. The same condition also stimulates hypothalamus nuclei in the thirst center, causing to just want to drink. This slide just describes this in osmoreceptors and the secretion of the special hormones and water in a kidney. Regulation of the sleep-wake cycle. Acting with other brain regions, the hypothalamus helps regulate the complex phenomenon of the sleep. It's responsible for the timing of the sleep-wake cycles, and here we see the hypothalamus regulation this cycle through the operation of its suprachiasmatic nuclei or biological clock, sets the timing of the sleep-wake cycle and responds to daylight darkness cues from the visual pathways, and the hypothalamus acts as the man of the endocrine system by producing realizing hormones. It controls the secretion of the different hormones of the body, special glands. And this supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei produce special hormones, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin hormone, but not produce it in a blood, just move it in a special pituitary gland, and these hormones move in a blood from this part of the brain. But we will study this in next semester. Hypothalamus, it is the autonomic regulatory center and emotional response center, and regulation of body temperature, food intake, regulation of water balance and thirst, regulation of the sleep-wake cycle, and hormonal activity. So we have the general slide which describes the function of the hypothalamus, and a little bit about a very close part. It is a pituitary gland, so it's so contact with the hypothalamus. Even we always say that the hypophyseal area. Anterior portion synthesize the secretes. Some of them you see here, and posterior portion store and secretes previous hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So these two parts of the brain work very closely. In addition, the hypothalamus is part of the limbic system, the function of which we will now discuss. So next part of the brain, the limbic system. The limbic system, as you see, this was originally defined as a series of the cortical structures surrounding the boundary between the cerebral hemispheres and the brainstem. And here we see the hypothalamic nucleus, and here the location of the limbic system. It is a part of the limbic system so much. The limbic system has originally defined as a series of cortical structures surrounding the boundary between the cerebral hemispheres and the brainstem. The function of this part of the brain are not yet fully understood, and we will only talk about some of them. And here we see some of them components. We have a lot of components, and the limbic system is the area of the brain that regulates emotion and memory. It directly connected the lower and higher brain functions, and here we see the function feeding, chewing and licking, emotion, autonomic function like a heart rate and respiratory rate and placidity, regulation of biological rhythm, material behavior, and motivation. And here we see this slide just in the start of the previous century. Paris was the first to describe a relationship between limbic system components and emotion, and Paris circuit connects the parahippocampal gyrus, hippocampus fornix, mammillary body, anterior thalamic nuclei, and cingulate gyrus, and all this circle. Since the individual description, connection to additional subcortical structures have been identified, and here we see this circle in another slide. Afferent and afferent connection of the limbic system, and all these nuclei in a circle control our emotion. So the parts hippocampus, it is a seahorse-shaped parrot structure, one in each hemispheres. Here we see like just a seahorse, and located in the infromedial part of the temporal lobe, involved in formation, organization, storage, the retrieval of the memory. And here we see the hippocampus originate as a part of the olfactory cortex, in lower animals, the sense of smell is an important determination of behavior. Is it good to eat? Does it smell like danger? Is it sexually individual, inviting? Therefore, the early hippocampus was involved in decision making by determining the importance of the incoming information, especially for animals. And here we see the hippocampal formation is compound structure in the medial temporal lobe of the brain. It consists of these parts: the hippocampus, dentate gyrus, subcolliculum, entorhinal area, and indusum grisum, gray matter in the upper surface of the corpus callosum. And here we see this one more, so it's difficult to understand, so much gyrus and orbitofrontal cortex. And what we have on the next slide, we have that all these parts very closely related to the temporal lobe, and here we see the even parts. Almost any type of sensory experience can cause activation of hippocampus and that initiate behavioral reaction. And here we see the three nerve cell layer response persists for many seconds after the stimulus is over. And here we see the spots. And here are roles: learning, memory, evolutionary role, smell, thing to eat, decision making for life or death, and helps control corticosteroids production, and if it's diseases such as amnesia, not long-term memory formation. Next part is the amygdala, complex of multiple small nuclei. Here we see the location, located immediately beneath the cerebral cortex in each temporal lobe. So we see this temporal lobe. Transmit signals back to same cortical areas, into hippocampus, into septum, into thalamus, into hypothalamus, so control the connection. And input from association area of visual, auditory, and somatosensory cortex, and output to hypothalamus and brainstem, autonomic nuclei to control the autonomic centers. And here we see the slides which just describes this amygdala function. Just this diagram of inputs and outputs. Next one, outputs connection, and small corticomedial group of nuclei related to olfactory cortex, especially in lower animals. It is the regions of amygdala, so it just controls the related olfactory cortex. So in general, amygdala function, it is involved in emotional responses, fear, anger, hormonal secretion, and memory, relate environmental stimuli to coordinate behavior, automatic and endocrine response seen in specific preservation. Response includes feeding and drinking, agnostic behavior, mating and maternal care, response to physical and emotional stress. And in general, one more function slide, behavioral, wide efferent connection with visual, auditory association area with wide efferent connections, and effects to stimulation for coordinate behavior, autonomic and endocrine response. And here we see this one more time. Next part, mammillary bodies. They are connected to other parts of the brain, act as a relay for impulses coming from the amygdala and hippocampi, where the mammillothalamic tract to the thalamus. Thus circuit from amygdala to mammillary bodies, and then on the thalamus is part of the large circle. They, along with the anterior and dorsomedial nuclei in the thalamus, are involved with the processing of memory. Septal nuclei, located anterior to the intraventricular foramen, belong to the rostrum of the corpus callosum, and main connection here with the septal area to hypothalamus through medial forebrain nuclear bundle, to habenular nucleus through stria medullaris thalami, and function it provides critical interconnection and it is a pleasure zone. So limbic cortex in general, cerebral association area for control behavior, the serine of limbic cortex, most poorly understood portion, so it's very little information here. What we have, the posterior orbital frontal cortex, anterior temporal cortex, and function. Here we see the olfactory behavioral and exert inhibitory as well as expressive influence of the emotional control, tendency for complex auditory association as well as complex through association derived from the area of the posterior temporal lobe, and so in general it is a behavior and emotion too. And here we see limbic system in general, all parts here inside the hemispheres. And it is all for today. It was big part of the brain, so we have the homework in book Animal Physiology, from the gans to organism. You should read the pages about nerve system, and even the video from the first slide. Here we see that just I have links in this video. And see you later. It will be the last practical about brain, and bye bye.